In the 18th century, the world's best player, François-André Danican Philidor, said, "Pawns are the soul of chess." Today, it's still the most famous chess quotation in history, which is actually amazing since chess has an endless amount of pithy chess quotes. But in my view, Philidor's is clearly the most profound. Though every tournament player is aware of this quote, few have really pondered what Philidor's words mean. Indeed, why are the pawns the soul of chess? The pawn structure tells you what to do. To understand this, you need to look at the pawns as your position's skeleton, the framework of everything your position is and can be. When a doctor studies a human skeleton, he can see if the person was tall or short, if he had broken bones, dental problems, or other diseases. A chess position's skeleton also shares information that a trained eye can see. It tells you what plan to make, what your goals are, which side of the board to play on, and what kind of tactics might be lurking behind the scenes. Flaws in your opponent's pawn formation can lead to holes that you can occupy or weak pawns that you can attack. Your pawns delineate how much space you own and whether or not a file will or will not be created. And a pass pawn can be part of a whole strategy, with your pieces and other pawns helping it dance down the board so it can turn into a queen. The purpose of this lecture is to train your eye to see the secrets of your pawn structure. For example, in Chess Skeleton 1, an experienced player would instantly know that white has a space advantage on the queen side, and he would love to place pressure on d6 and double his rooks on the c file, since he can open that file at any moment. Black's center pawns, which are aiming at the king side, lets both sides know that black's proper plan is to gain kingside space by pushing his f7 pawn forward. And perhaps even continuing on to f4, where he gains even more kingside space. This will lead, other than just space, to a possible kingside attack. Notice that other than the kings and pawns, neither side has any pieces. In an actual game, both sides would have a full army, and they would move their pieces to the squares that allow them to follow the information gleaned by the study of the pawn structure. Look at Chess Skeleton 2. The center is completely closed, which means that both sides need to seek play on the wings. Black's pawn chain from f7 to c4 points to the queen side, so an experienced player would instantly know that he should play b5 to b4, which gains even more space and also prepares to open the b file for his rooks by capturing on c3. White would strive to begin active operations on the king side by an eventual f4 to f5 advance, gaining kingside space and also expanding the f-file for white's rooks. Our third chess skeleton features opposite side castling. This often means that white will attack black's king on the king side, while black will go after white's king on the queen side. To achieve this, black will double rooks on the half-open c-file and also advance his queenside pawns in that sector. In other words, he'll bring as much stuff to bear in that sector as possible. White intends to advance his kingside pawns and rupture black's kingside pawn cover. A sequence like h2 to h4 to h5 and h6, and also perhaps g5 and then g6 would achieve that goal. Also, white has another plus. Black's d-pawn is sitting on an open d-file, and white's rooks can hit that pawn and tie black down to its defense. All three of these skeletal explorations would process instantly in the experienced player's mind. But every journey starts somewhere, and this lecture will be your first step into the world of positional patterns, and in time will give you the ability to quick read positions just like I did with the three chess skeletons. We'll start out with the big pawn center. This is a great way to highlight not only the skeletal structure, but also the image of a line of pawns being like a fence, everything behind it being yours, and everything ahead of it being your opponent's. This position arose from an opening called the hippopotamus. It sets up a solid structure that will, ideally, repel any enemy advance. Quite a few blitz chess aficionados use this opening since they can make black's moves very quickly, thereby saving lots of time on the clock. The problem with the opening is that it lets white build a huge pawn center that annexes a good deal of space. The pawns on d4, e4, and f4 look very much like a fence, and it's easy to see that white's pieces have much more room to move about in than black's, which are mainly stuck on the last two ranks. A quick read shows that black has various pawn advances that may or may not help his position. Perhaps pawn to b5, or pawn to c5, or pawn to d5, pawn to e5, or even pawn to f5. White has to keep an eye out for all of them, since at some point black will be forced to reach for more territory. A glance at white's position shows that he can play pawn to d5 at some point, but that hangs a pawn to simply e takes d5. It also gives the d7 knight, which had a very limited choice of movement, access to c5. If you push this pawn to d5, it opens up the c5 square. Another advance is e5, but that instantly opens up the diagonal for black's bishop. The pawn on e4 blocked it before. Once you push the pawn, that diagonal is wide open space. What about f5? This makes a lot of sense. Let's have a look. If white plays f5, gains kingside space, it opens up this diagonal for the bishop right at black's king. And it gives more room for this f1 rook, which now has the beginnings of a possible open file. A lot of good things. So all three of white's pawn advances are possible, but only one is good. The moves d5 and e5 gave up squares without any real gain. f5, on the other hand, increased the activity of white's e3 bishop and his rook on f1, while also gaining kingside space. So f5 is the move. E takes f5, e takes f5. White's e1 rook now suddenly has an open e-file, while the other rook is doing pretty well on the f-file thanks to this push. Black, realizing that he's going to get swamped, has to challenge in the middle, so he plays c5, cracking the d4 pawn. Notice that this bishop at d4 puts some pressure. This knight might go here and add to that pressure. So now white has started a battle, and black has to start his own battle and try to get something going. White, of course, gets rid of that bishop. Remember, we talked about weakening the dark squares around a king. By getting rid of that bishop, we would then have holes on f6, g7, and h6. Black takes. We take with the bishop. He takes back, and we regain our pawn. Black doesn't really like this position. It's kind of scary. His king's a little open. White has tons of space. Black's rooks aren't doing much, and white's rooks are just beating down those two files. So the king decides to move out of there. We took, and now there's a problem. If you take this way, you're walking into a possible knight e6. So instead, he takes back this way, but of course, queen h6 check is very disturbing. King g8, and now we just want to bring our pieces to the king. And black is on his way down. The big threat is bringing the rook here, and then white's queen can come in for a checkmate. So black desperately plays knight f5, and after knight takes f5, pawn takes. The simplest way is kind of flashy. Rook g4 check. He has to take it, and now we've opened up this diagonal for the bishop, and queen h7 mate. Of course, black played some bad moves there. This is just illustration. The main thing is when you see the structure, you have to look for the pawn breaks and then choose the one you feel is best. But if you're not looking for pawn breaks, and if you're not looking at the structure, everything you do will be wrong. Here's an actual game from 1911 where the battle for the center starts as early as move 4. Usual moves. Both sides are developing, gaining some influence in the center, getting their pieces out. Everything's fine. We have a Joko piano going, and now white plays c3. What he's doing is he's ready to play the pawn to d4, and the c3 pawn will bolster that advance. Black plays d6, which is an old-fashioned move. There are better things that were found later. White continues with his plan, d4. Black takes it. The capture's back, and here we are. Already, if you look at the center, white has two center pawns that are advanced and gaining lots of space, and black's only center pawn is doing far less. So the battle is based around really a question. Are these pawns strong, or are they targets? Are they weak? That's not so easy to understand or to actually answer. So what's going to happen is both sides need to prove this point. If the pawns turn out strong, white's going to win. If the pawns are weak, white's going to have some trouble. So every move is critical. So in this case, white plays knight c3, black plays knight f6, both sides castle, which is, of course, very important. White has that nice center, black needs to attack it. And in this position, white plays the strange bishop b3. You go, well, wait a second, what in the world does that have to do with anything? The reason is, let's say white played h3, which you'd like to do to stop the pin here. But that allows a tactic. Knight takes e4, knight takes e4, d5, and you get your piece right back. The initial sacrifice destroys the pawn center, and the next move gets the material right back and leaves white with a decimated center. So he didn't want to allow that. He saw it. By playing bishop b3, there's no longer a fork after d5, and that combination won't work. Now white would like to play h3 next move if he's allowed, which would then keep all his pieces in play and leave the center very well guarded. So black has to challenge that knight because the knight is one of the biggest defenders of d4. So basically, bishop g4 attacks d4. I know that sounds strange, but by attacking the guardian of d4, it actually attacks d4. So white has to guard it. He plays bishop e3. And now black really needed to play something serious. In the game, he played h6, which wasn't so good. He needed to really take this. If the queen takes, this pawn would be dead because there's two pieces attacking it to one. So what he would do is have to take with the pawn, and at least you've ruptured his center. It's not so big, but in this situation, it's still, I like the position for white, but, you know, it's still a war. However, he didn't do that. He played a very passive move, pawn h6, and white immediately grabs a hold of everything there. Both pawns are now safe. The rook hits e4. So you notice black has two pieces, here and here, attacking d4. He has two pieces, the rook and the knight attacking e4, but everything is guarded. It's still a big battle for this. And now white avoids the double pawns, retreats his knight, which now gives three different pieces the ability to guard e4 and leaves this bishop hanging out to dry. So after knight d2, queen e7, rook ae1, all white wants to do is just keep bolstering this center. Rook a d8. And now just a3, keeping the black knight out of b4. He's just taking away all the squares. White has lots of space. And if you can just take all the squares away from the guy, he'll just be sitting in there in this little tiny cage. So with everything guarded, first white built the center, then he protected the center. Now that it's protected, he can gain more space. And so he plays f4, taking everything. The bishop now can be trapped if he's not careful with f5. So the bishop has to retreat. And now white just keeps everything out of g4. And suddenly black is just crushed. There's nothing he can do. He moved his king, and white just keeps taking everything, all the space in the universe. Knight e7, moves his king out of the way. The guy finally, okay, and he strikes in the center, but all that did is make it worse. E5, knight h7, f5. And now after f6, e6. And here we'll stop. The position is hopelessly lost. The guy's in a tiny little cage now. He can hardly move anything. He has nothing to attack. He can't do anything. It's just awful. And he went on to lose the game. You can win games just by gaining space like this, just by building a big center, guarding it, and then gaining more and more space. It doesn't take checkmates. It doesn't take tactics. Something like this, smooth, easy. It's a great strategy. As you can see, a big pawn center can be very dangerous. And one might think that every experienced player would avoid allowing the opponent to build one. But that's not the case. In fact, a popular strategy is to let the opponent build a big pawn center and then treat that center as a target, hitting it with everything he's got. The grunfeld defense, which is an extremely popular opening, is based on this exact premise. Knight f6, g6, knight c3, and now d5. This position is the grunfeld. He's going to give up his center pawn for the side c pawn and allow white a big center with the express plan of attacking that center. After c takes d5, knight takes d5, e4, he captures, and now here's white's large center. It looks great. But black decides the target is going to be d4. And so now everything he's going to do, everything he's going to think about is attacking this thing. Every move is going to be about this particular target on d4. Bishop g7. White continues to develop his pieces. He can't leave them at home. And black hits it again. Suddenly, this one pawn is attacked by the queen, the bishop, and this pawn. So white goes knight e2 and guards it. Black castles and white castles. Knight c6, developing and continuing the attack. Now, this pawn is attacked by the knight, the pawn, and the bishop. Bishop e3, guarding it. Queen c7, rook c1, and now rook d8. And here we have it, the modern type of strategy where both sides have a plan, and each plan is being countered by the other. So in this case, white's saying, philosophically, I have this monster center, it's going to squeeze you to death, it's going to beat you. And black is saying, no, 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 no. That pawn center is a target. I'm going to hit it with everything I have, and it's a weakness. I'm going to tear it down, and you're going to lose. So in these type of positions, anything can happen. The game goes on and on. Whoever plays the best is going to be the victor. No one knows who's going to win this thing. That's why everybody plays it. You're not going to play something you know isn't going to work for you. And it's, once again, all about philosophy and carrying through with your plan from beginning to end. Here's another opening sequence that illustrates the central battle, while also introducing us to a new topic, the pawn chain. A French defense, very popular, very scrappy opening. The one flaw with this opening is that it locks in the c8 bishop. This is called the Tarrasch variation. And you notice that the center is locked up. And so what's going to happen is black's going to try to crash through on the queen side, gain a lot of space. White's going to try to get something on the king side because that's where his pawns are pointing. These games are often extremely complex. So right away, white grabs even more space in that sector. Black gains space in his sector. And black now hits d4 again. You notice now there is the pawn hitting d4 and the knight hitting d4. So there's two pieces attacking it, only one guarding it on c3. So white protects that pawn again. Now he's guarding it with his queen, knight, and the c pawn. Black ups the ante. Now he adds more pressure. He's attacking d4 3 times, but he's also eyeing b2, so if this bishop were to move, that b2 pawn might fall. And white guards d4 yet again. You notice if you're not aware of the structure and how to deal with the structure, you wouldn't be playing these moves. Both sides are doing what they're supposed to do based on the structure. Attack the center, guard the center. White builds the center, he guards it. Black goes after the center and starts putting pressure on it. If you don't do that, if either side fails to do that, they're going to fail all around. They're going to lose the game. So in this position, Black can't put more pressure on d4. So what he decides to do is go for the front pawn. And he plays f6, upping the ante and putting a lot of pressure all over the center. White is having trouble getting the rest of his pieces out. So he plays g3 so this bishop on f1 can move somewhere. Black captures at d4 and then gets his bishop out with a check. The knight blocks the check and Black castles. And here Black is doing quite well. He's castled, White isn't. He's putting pressure on the center, and now it's this huge battle of the space that White owns versus the pressure that Black's putting on it. And it's just complete chaos. Anybody can get ripped apart at any moment. And that's the way these things go. This endless battle. Attack the center, build the center. A pawn chain is best attacked at the base, which is the first pawn in the string of pawns. Since once the base falls, all the others do too, in much the same way that dominoes cascade when you tip over the first one. In our French defense game, Black attacked the pawn chain at the front, and that's also effective in many instances, but hitting the base is the ideal, though it's much harder to achieve than a simple frontal attack. e4, c5, knight c3, knight c6, g3, g6. This is known as the closed Sicilian. Bishop g2, bishop g7, and just normal types of moves that have been seen many times before. Okay, in general, White is going to try to get something going on the king side. He might push this f-pawn, opening up the f-file and getting an attack. Black's pawns are aimed at the queen side, and he wants to push this b-pawn as far as he can and gain even more space in that sector. So, Black plays the strange-looking rook b8. And what that does is it bolsters this pawn, this b-pawn here, and allows him to push it, which was his plan. So after rook b8, White continues developing, b5. Everybody's getting their pieces out. b4, and there's that space. And you notice this long chain of pawns. This is a pawn chain. Here's the base, and it goes out to here. The knight retreats. Bishop to d7. You have to get your pieces out. White castles, queen c8, and now the strange-looking knight f4, a move I'm not fond of. Knight f6, and now Black threatens knight g4, and then he can pick up this important bishop at e3. So White decides, okay, I'm not going to allow that, and he plays f3. But that's ugly too. I don't like the way White's playing this game. Castles. Knight f2, and Black continues annexing space on the queen side. And White plays g4, announcing that he's going to try to start something on the king side, which is what he's supposed to do. He has to get something going. Black just retreats. White plays c3. That's a double-edged move because at any moment, Black can capture and open up this file for his rook. On the other hand, by playing c3, he's stopped Black from putting a piece on this d4 square. So there's something good about it, and something bad. a4, knight e2, and here's the point of this game. Black notices that b2 is the base of the pawn chain. White's pawns start right at b2, and so he cracks it. And if you look at this is quite a remarkable moment, because by doing this, you now see that both these pawns are being attacked. This bishop at g7 is joining in on that love fest of destruction against this pawn chain, and white's pawns are going to basically just fragment and fall away, and the queen's side is going to be ripped open, and black will have a fantastic game. This is an ideal situation where you attack at the base, you attack the one after that too, but the base creates that domino effect we talked about. We'll end this section's positional pawn explorations with a look at something all amateurs fear, the passed pawn. In this position, material's even, but white has a passed pawn on c5, and it intends to go all the way down the board to that final magical square where it can turn into a queen. One might think that it can be stopped, and in many cases it can, but here the pawn is like an out-of-control freight train. It starts as a little migration towards c8, rook c8, trying to stop it, c7. It's all ready, and now the king says, God, I have to help out, but it's too late. Bishop a6, attacking the key square, and black is going to lose enormous amounts of material, and the game is over. Basically, if he were to move the rook somewhere, otherwise it'll be captured, you win the rook anyway by making a queen, and you're just a rook up for nothing, and there's no reason to play on. So, are passed pawns really deadly killing machines? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. In fact, a passed pawn can even be a liability if an ideal blockade is created. Here, it's black's move, but he's dead loss due to the superiority of the knight over a bishop in a closed position. The pressure white's rook is placing against the b7 pawn, the passed d pawn, which gains space and is an eventual threat to run for a touchdown, and the potential weaknesses of the pawns on c5 and e5. Let's look at a possible sequence. Bishop e8, knight to b5. This is a very profound move. It attacks a7, but you think, well, who cares? He's just going to go a6 and chase you away. That's true, but after the knight retreats, what we've done is we've created a hole on b6. Before, the pawn was on a7, controlling that. But now, by making him push that pawn, this hole can be used by the rook, which can then jump into b6 and control the square in front of the passed pawn. So, white plays knight to d1, and he intends to bring the knight to d3 where it's going to hit both the c5 and e5 pawns. Black's king has to get into the action. Knight to f2, king e7, and now the knight goes here, putting permanent pressure, and black's losing material. Why? Because after king d6, really the only way to guard this stuff, now we use this one hole that we created by that initial attack on the a7 pawn. Rook b6 check. The poor king has to move away, and there goes material and the game. This example showed us that a passed pawn doesn't have to run right away, but the threat of it running is always in the air and forces the defender to keep it as contained as possible. Now let's look at the same position, but we'll switch the minor pieces, giving black the knight and white the light-squared bishop. The difference is that black's knight is commanding the board. It's blockading the passed d pawn. It's eyeing the c4 pawn. It's keeping white's rook off of the b5 square, and it's defending the b7 pawn. In this position, the only one that can even dream of winning is black. Though with proper play, white should draw. Clearly, it's very important to blockade an enemy passed pawn. The best blockaders are knights, since they freeze the enemy passer and still reach in every direction. We've gone over a lot of advanced material here, and the only way to absorb these lessons is to review all of it over and over. In chess, repetition is king. Even so, you might find that some of these ideas are a bit too much. That's natural. Do your best. Continue playing as many games as you can, and over time, these concepts will become a part of you. When you think you have a reasonably firm grip on this material, you'll be ready for our next lecture, which continues our exploration of pawns.